It was the 8th of August, 1942, just past midnight, off the coast of an island almost no one in America could have found on a map. In the anchorage, transport ships rode quietly in the dark, their hold still half full of food and ammunition. On the shore, 11,000 United States Marines slept on captured ground. The first soil taken back from Japan in the whole Pacific War. It had been so far almost easy. Then, in the first hour after midnight, the sea to the northwest began to flash. Out by a small volcanic island called Savo, guns spoke in the dark for half an hour, and 4 Allied cruisers went down in one of the hardest nights the United States Navy has ever endured. And when the sun came up, the transports were gone. The horizon was empty. 11,000 men stood on the beach of an island they barely knew, alone. They would hold that island for 6 months, through jungle and fever and rain, through battles on land and sea, and in the air, until the waters beside it had earned a grimmer name. One the sailors themselves would give it in the nights that were coming. This is the complete story of Guadalcanal. From the first quiet morning to the last empty beach, before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. Videos like this one take weeks to research and build, and that one small click genuinely keeps the watch going. Now, get comfortable. Let the sound of the surf come in over the reef, and let's go back to the beginning. So settle in. Let the room grow quiet around you, and we will begin where this whole long story had to begin. Not with an army and not with a battle, but with a place. A place that, in the summer of 1942, almost no one in America could have found on a map, and fewer still could have spelled. The Solomon Islands lie in the South Pacific, scattered in a long double column that runs down from the northwest toward the southeast. A few degrees below the equator, there are several hundred of them in all. A few large, most of them small, green and steep, and wrapped in cloud, with warm sea in every direction, and near the far end of one column, a long way down from the big island of Bougainville at their head, lies a long green island called Guadalcanal. Most of the chain lay under a quiet colonial arrangement. Bougainville and Buka, at the top, belonged to the Australian-mandated territory of New Guinea. Everything else in that double line was the British Solomon Islands Protectorate. A handful of district officers, a scattering of planters and traders and missionaries, and a small, comfortable capital on the little island of Tulagi, whose harbor was the finest anchorage in the southern Solomons. It was about as far from the center of anything as a place could be. The islands themselves were mostly volcanic, jagged, jungle-covered, and steaming. They lie in what one account calls, without exaggeration, the wettest area in the world. Steep peaks and knife-backed ridges rose out of the green, cut apart by fast eroding rivers, and the whole chain seemed to breathe a hot, wet air that never quite cooled. Guadalcanal was one of the larger islands, roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, its long axis running from the southeast up toward the northwest. A spine of mountains ran down its length and fell away steeply to the southern shore. But along the north coast, from the mouth of a river called the Lunga, the land opened out into something gentler, a broad belt of plains, laced with streams and patched with tall grass, the kind of well-watered ground that men had been planting with coconut palms since the turn of the century. The rivers of that coast came in 2 kinds. Some were long, quick, and shallow. The Tenaru, the Lunga, the balasuna, the sort a man could wade across without much thought. Others were slow and deep, coiling to the sea through banks of mud, more like lagoons than rivers, the Matnikau, and the slow creek the maps called Alligator Creek. Over all of it lay the heat, an average temperature near 90 degrees, a humid, close to 30 Celsius warmth that soaked through everything. There were no real seasons here, only changes in the intensity of the rain, and the afternoons brought their downpours as regularly as a clock. The island had been named a very long time before, by Spanish sailors who found a little gold in these waters in 1568 and let themselves believe they had reached the source of King Solomon's fabled riches, so the whole chain became the Islands of Solomon, a beautiful mistake that outlived every fortune never found there. For centuries after, the island stayed almost entirely out of the American imagination. The few who had heard the name at all were most likely readers of Jack London, whose short story, The Red One, is set on that very island, spelled in his day in the older form, Guadalcanal. To everyone else it was nothing, a dot, a rumor of palms and fever at the bottom edge of the sea. And then, quite suddenly, the war came looking for it. On the 23rd of January, 1942, Japanese forces took Rabaul on the island of New Britain and turned it into a great forward base, a springboard for a long reach southward. Within months, that reach came down the Solomons like a hand moving down a rope. On the 4th of May, Japanese landing forces stepped ashore at Tulagi, took the little colonial capital, and began improving its harbor into a base for seaplanes. At first, they went no further, but about a month later, survey parties crossed the 20-mile strait from Tulagi to Guadalcanal, walked out onto the flat grassland behind the Lunga, and saw exactly what an engineer sees: a natural airfield, already half built by nature, needing only to be graded and rolled. They finished their survey toward the end of June. In the first days of July, 1942, they went to work in earnest. Here is where the story turns on something small and human. The ground they chose to grade was not wilderness. It was a plantation. The coconut groves that ran back from Lunga Point had been planted and tended for decades by Lever Brothers, the soap and copra company, whose local headquarters sat on a little island across the strait. For years, quiet men had walked those neat rows, gathering copra to be pressed into oil an ocean away. Now, in the space of a few weeks, the same flat green ground by the sea became a construction site. Around the 6th of July, some 400 Japanese soldiers and engineers came ashore at the Lunga, along with roughly 2,000 Korean laborers, and began to carve a runway out of the palms. It is worth holding that image, because it is the hinge of everything that follows. One stretch of level earth beside a warm sea. First, a peaceful trade in coconut oil, known to almost no one. Then a prize that two nations would fight over for half a year. The tiny green island that only readers of Jack London had ever heard of was about to become, for a few months, the axis on which the whole Pacific War would turn. Word of that runway did not travel by accident. As early as the beginning of June, reconnaissance had noticed the Japanese eyeing the Lunga Plains for an airfield. And that single fact helped push the American command toward doing something it was not yet ready to do. The men who kept the closest count were the coast watchers. When the Japanese came, most of the Europeans had been evacuated, but a scattering of courageous old island hands, planters and officials who knew the country in their bones simply refused to leave. They went up into the bush with their radios, and from there they watched the enemy by land, by sea, and by air, and reported what they saw day after day to an intelligence center far to the south in Australia. The division that would soon land here later called their service, quite simply, invaluable. By late June, the American High Command had made its decision. Admiral King warned that an offensive was coming into the Lower Solomons. A directive went out at the start of July, and the operation received a suitably grand code name, Watchtower. But the men who had to carry it out, scraping together ships and supplies that barely existed, soon gave it a truer name of their own, Operation Shoestring. It was assembled on almost nothing in almost no time. The nearest field for heavy bombers lay some 975 miles away. There was not a single accurate, complete map of the island. The Marines would go in with a rough tracing copied by hand from the memories of men who had once lived there. From an intelligence point of view, one officer admitted, the whole thing was little more than a stab in the dark. And so the far green island that had never mattered to anyone was about to matter to everyone. Toward it, across that great empty sea, two forces were already moving in the dark. And neither of them yet knew the other at all. They were two armies, gathered from opposite ends of the earth. And it is worth sitting with them a while tonight. With who they were, what they had already been through, and what they believed they were sailing toward. Each was about to meet a stranger in the dark, and to learn, the hard way, exactly who that stranger was. Start with the one coming by sea. It was the 1st Marine Division, a division of the United States Marine Corps, under a Major General named Alexander Archer Vandegrift, a soft-spoken Virginian who would one day rise to become the 18th Commandant of the Corps. But in the summer of 1942, he commanded a green outfit that had never yet fought a battle, and that fully expected not to fight one for a long while. When the orders came, in late June, the division was still moving in pieces from the United States to Wellington, in New Zealand. Its advance echelon had barely arrived. Its rear echelon would not reach New Zealand until the middle of July. Vandegrift had every reason to believe that months of training lay ahead of him, and that his men would not be committed to combat before the beginning of 1943. Instead, he was given about 3 weeks. He was also short a third of his infantry. Back in March, one of his regiments, the 7th Marines, reinforced, had been detached and sent off to help garrison Samoa. So the division that was about to make the first American amphibious offensive of the entire war would make it without a full third of its riflemen, scattered in another part of the ocean entirely. To understand how thin all of this was, it helps to know how small the Corps still was. In those days, the entire Marine Corps numbered fewer than 143,000 men, of whom only about 57,000 were serving overseas at all. The 1st Division was the single large unit ready to be thrown into action on short notice. And it was being thrown, ready or not. Vandegrift himself put it plainly, in words that have followed the campaign ever since. Seldom, he wrote, has an operation been begun under more disadvantageous circumstance. He did what he could to close the gap. His intelligence officer, a lieutenant colonel named Frank Göttke, was sent across to Australia to hunt down anyone who had ever known these islands. The traders, the planters, the schooner captains, the old hands, and to squeeze from their memories the map that no chart could give him. And then there was the simple, grinding labor of getting ready. On the docks at Wellington, under a cold driving rain the locals called the southerly, the Marines unloaded and repacked their own ships by hand. Cardboard cartons dissolved in the wet. Rice and sugar ran together into a brown paste underfoot. The civilian stevedores had gone out on strike, so the Marines worked the cargo themselves, around the clock, in 8-hour shifts, 300 men to a ship. When it was done, the division sailed carrying 60 days of supplies and 10 units of fire, and less than half of the vehicles it was supposed to have. It went to war light and hungry and improvising. Now turned to the other army, the one already on the island and the far larger one gathering behind it. The truth of what waited on Guadalcanal was almost the opposite of what the Americans feared. Intelligence estimates ran as high as 8,000 defenders, and the invasion plan guessed at more than 5,000 on the island alone. But when the counting was finally honest, there were only about 2,000 Japanese in the Lunga area, and almost none of them were soldiers in any real sense. They were the builders and the guards of the airfield, construction troops with rifles, not a fighting garrison. Across the strait, on Tulagi and its neighbors, there were perhaps 1,500 more, and several hundred of those were laborers too. The great prize for the moment was defended by men who had come to pour concrete, not to hold a line, but behind them stood something else entirely, the task of holding, and soon of retaking. The Southern Solomons had been handed to the Japanese 17th Army, a corps-level command based at Rabaul, under a lieutenant general named Harukichi Hyakutake. It had been activated only in May, and at the moment the Americans landed it was deeply committed elsewhere, straining across the mountains of New Guinea in the long and brutal drive toward Port Moresby. It could spare, at first, only a handful of units for Guadalcanal. That mismatch, a mighty army looking the wrong way, a construction crew standing in its place, would shape the whole opening act of the campaign. So here were the two armies, on the eve of it all. The Marines believed they were sailing toward thousands of defenders and would find a few hundred builders fleeing into the jungle. The Japanese believed the landings, when they heard of them, were no more than a raid to be brushed off. Each was wrong about the other in a way that would cost dearly to correct. And between them, standing quietly on the island itself, was a third kind of man, one who belonged to neither army and knew the ground better than both. His name was Martin Clemens. He was a young British district officer, a member of the island's small defense force. And when the Japanese came ashore, he made a choice that most men would not have made. He did not evacuate. He went up into the hills instead, to a hidden radio near a place called Iola Bay, and he became a coast watcher, living rough in the bush of an island the enemy now claimed to own, keeping his eyes on their every move and waiting for the day someone would come to take it back. Clemens did not do this alone, and that is the heart of it. He worked with a network of island scouts, Solomon Islanders who knew every stream and ridge and hidden track, who could move through the country like water and count an enemy column without ever being seen. It was their island after all. By day it might belong to the men with the rifles, but by night, and in the high green hills, it still belonged to the people who had always lived there, and they watched over it for him. Among those scouts was a man whose name we will come back to later, when the fighting is at its worst. Jacob Vusa was a retired sergeant major of the native police, a solid, weathered man who had given some 25 years of his life to the constabulary before laying down the uniform in retirement. When the war reached his island, he put it back on. For now it is enough to know that he was there. One more islander who had chosen a side, moving quietly through the bush with Clemens and the scouts. His hour would come. It is not yet. So that was the human shape of it as the last quiet days ran out. A green American division, undermanned and improvising, sailing toward an island it could barely map. A handful of Japanese construction troops on the beach, and a great army behind them looking the other way. And threaded invisibly through the hills, a British officer and his island scouts, watching, counting, waiting, the only ones, perhaps, who truly understood the ground. Two armies, then, still strangers to each other, converging on the same stretch of coconut palms by the sea, each sure, in its own way, that the fight ahead would be decided by men. It would not be decided by men alone. The island was 90 miles long, laid out along a spine of jungled mountains, breathing heat and rain. It had been waiting on that ground long before either army arrived, and it would still be there long after both were gone. It wore no uniform and carried no flag, and it would fight, in its patient way, against everyone. To the old Marines who had once served in Nicaragua or Haiti, this green country looked almost familiar. It was not. Guadalcanal would prove a formidable enemy to Japanese and Americans alike. The first thing was the heat. Day after day the temperature sat up under 90 degrees, around 30 on the Celsius scale, and the air never once dried out. This was one of the wettest corners of the world, and its seasons were not so much wet and dry as rain and more rain. Most afternoons the sky would darken, and a warm tropical downpour would come straight down through the trees, drumming on helmets and canvas, filling every low place in the ground, and then move off again, leaving the whole island steaming. Away from the beaches, the jungle closed in. In much of it, a man could see only a few yards in any direction. A green wall of vines and roots and rotting leaves, so thick that a patrol could lose itself 100 yards from its own lines. Where the trees thinned, the ground gave way to fields of kunai grass, tall as a man and edged like a blade, that could open a hand or a forearm at a careless grip. Nothing about the country made itself easy. It resisted the boot, the map, and the eye at every step. It was a loud place, too, in its own way. Bright tropical birds, parrots and cockatoos, screeched from the canopy at dawn and at dusk. Land crabs rustled through the leaf litter. After dark, the air filled with the whine of insects and the small green sparks of fireflies. And over all of it hung the thick, sweetish smell of green things rotting and regrowing at the same time. In the sluggish lagoons at the river mouths, where the water lay deep and still against muddy banks, there were crocodiles, keeping their own slow watch against the muddy banks. Put all of it together, the heat that never broke, the rain that never stopped, the green walls and the biting grass, and the smell of rot, and the effect on a man was less a series of hardships than a single closing pressure. The island did not attack. It simply pressed in from every side at once, slow and patient and everywhere, and asked of a soldier a kind of endurance that had nothing to do with courage. Long before the first real battle, the country was already at work on both armies, wearing them down day by damp day. But the most dangerous thing on the island was too small to see. In the standing water and the shade, the Anopheles mosquito bred in its countless millions, and it carried malaria. The Americans had already met it before they ever reached Guadalcanal. On the islands to the south, A single defense battalion had logged more than 130 cases of malaria, among fewer than 1,000 men in 1 month alone. The drug atabrine had not yet arrived in any quantity. Quinine was short, and the medical officers were writing urgent requests for enormous amounts of it. This was the enemy that never rested and never showed itself. A man could stand every watch, win every firefight, and still be carried off the island on a stretcher, shaking with fever, having never once seen the thing that beat him. Before the campaign was over, malaria and its sister fevers would put thousands of men out of the fight. In the end, the island's diseases would fell more of them than the shooting did. The mosquito was the Third Army's quietest soldier. It was also by a wide margin its most effective one. The men who faced all this were not fresh to begin with. Even the voyage out had worn them thin. On one of the chartered ships that carried the division toward New Zealand, the galley served only 2 meals a day, and the ration worked out to less than 1,500 calories. Some men stepped ashore having lost more than 20 pounds. They had crossed an ocean growing lean and tired before a shot was fired, and now they were bound for a coast that seemed built to finish whatever the sea had started. The coast itself was uneven ground for an army. Off Tulagi and along much of Guadalcanal, broad shelves of coral lay just beneath the surface, treacherous to any boat that came in too fast. But at one place along the northern shore, near a point called Lunga, the bottom fell away steeply close in, so that even large ships could stand almost against the land. It was a small accident of geology, and it would matter more than anyone yet understood. The one good doorway on a difficult coast. Behind that doorway, the country opened out. Where the Lunga River ran down to the sea, the jungle gave way on one side to long, orderly rows of coconut palms. A plantation that the trading house of Lever Brothers had set out for copra in the quiet years before the war. Between the palms and the trees lay a wide, flat stretch of ground, and across it the Japanese had been scraping out an airfield. Behind all of it, green and deceptively near, rose the long hump of a mountain the maps would call Mount Austin. When the Marines came, they would inherit that ground and much of what stood on it. The Japanese had left behind their unfinished runway and the stores that had fed the men who built it. Piles of sacks in the sheds, and among them a great deal of rice. In the weeks to come, that captured rice would help keep the Americans fed. There was something strange in the housekeeping of it. Moving into an enemy's half-built camp, eating an enemy's food, sleeping under an enemy's coconut trees, on an island that belonged to neither of them. All of that still lay ahead. For now the island simply waited, hot, wet, green, and wholly indifferent, while 2 fleets converged on it out of the dark. On the last night of July, 19,000 Marines were already at sea, steaming north from the Fijis toward a shore almost none of them had ever seen, toward the gray morning when the war would finally come ashore. The morning came gray and calm. Before first light on the 7th of August, 1942, the transports felt their way into the strait between Guadalcanal and Florida. 19 of them, with 4 fast destroyer transports, carrying the better part of 19,000 Marines who had sailed up from the Fijis 8 days before. Somewhere in the dark ahead lay the coast none of them had a proper map for. On the flagship, the division command post opened at 5:15 in the morning, and the men began to climb down into their boats. The warships opened fire on the shoreline a little after 6. By 6:45, the transports had reached their stations off the beach, and the signal went out to land the landing force. The first wave, the 5th Marines, with the 1st Marines close behind, turned toward a strip of sand some 9,000 yards east of Lunga Point that the plan called Beach Red. H hour was set for 9:10. At 19 minutes past 9, the 1st Marine stepped onto Guadalcanal, and nothing happened. Not a single shot met them. The garrison was simply not there. The men who held this stretch of coast were mostly laborers, and the troops set to guard them. And when the bombardment began, they had taken it for a raid and slipped back into the jungle and the hills inland. So the largest amphibious operation the United States had yet attempted came ashore against empty sand. The planners had feared as many as 5,000 defenders here. In truth, there were perhaps 2,000, and most of those carried shovels rather than rifles. Boat after boat grounded and emptied. The Marines pushed inland through the coconut groves, tents, weapons up, waiting for the fire that never came. By evening, 2 reinforced regiments and the whole weight of the division stood on the island. It was, for all its size, the quietest landing of the war. And it was strange precisely because, at that very hour, across the 20 miles of water to the north, the war was as loud as it would ever be. The same dawn that met the Marines on Guadalcanal with silence met another force, on other beaches, with everything the defenders had left to give. The little island of Tulagi had been the seat of the British administration, and its harbor was the finest in the southern Solomons. The Japanese had held it since May. At 8 in the morning, the 1st Raider Battalion, under a lean and quiet colonel named Merritt Edson, went ashore there alongside a battalion of the 5th Marines, about 1,000 men in all, and walked straight into the first real fight of the campaign. 20 minutes before the main landing, a covering party had already set foot on the neighboring shore of Florida. A platoon sergeant named Harry Schuler was the first American to stand on Japanese-held ground in the Solomons. The defenders of Tulagi knew what was coming, and they meant to sell the place dearly. At 8:10 that morning, a last message went out from the island by radio. Back toward the Japanese command. The enemy force, it said, was overwhelming, and they would defend the island to the last man. Then the set fell silent. It would take the Marines the rest of that day, and most of the next, to make those words come true for them. Tulagi and its neighbors were not secured until 3 days of fighting had passed. The hardest ground of all was a pair of tiny islands joined by a stone causeway, Gavutu and Tanambogo, twin knobs of coral, each crowned by a low hill little more than 100 feet high, so placed that each covered the other's approaches. Parachute troops went in against Gavutu around midday. Their commander was hit within the first 20 minutes, and another officer stepped up to take his place. That evening, a small party tried for Tanambogo in the dark, and a shell touched off a fuel dump on the shore. The sudden firelight lit their boats like a stage, and there was nothing to do but pull back. They came again the next day, in daylight, with infantry and 2 light tanks grinding up from the water's edge. The fighting was close and confused, and it cost them. One of the tank commanders was killed, and one of the tanks was lost. But by the end of the 8th of August, the Causeway Islands had been taken, and the whole cluster around Tulagi Harbor had passed into American hands. Across one narrow strait, on the same 2 mornings, the war had shown both its faces. On the great island, almost nothing at all. On the small ones, everything at once. On Guadalcanal itself, the second day belonged to the airfield. On the 8th of August, a battalion of the 1st Marines pushed across the half-built runway and down to the Lunga, while the 5th Marines reached the main Japanese camp in the afternoon. The defenders had gone, and they had gone in haste, close to the edge of collapse, without pausing to destroy what they abandoned. Behind them stood everything they had built since July: camps and wharves and bridges, machine shops and power plants, 2 radio stations, and a runway 3/4 finished, waiting for aircraft that would now never arrive. Nothing had been blown up. Sheds stood full of food and ammunition. Engineering gear and radio sets sat where their crews had dropped them. Road machines had been left out in the open, some of them with the keys still near at hand. For a division that had sailed with less than half its motor transport and far too little of everything else, it was a windfall past hoping for. They had come to take an airfield, and they had been handed one almost whole, together with the tools to finish it. It was, from that first day, a strange and telling thing. A campaign that would be fought in no small part on the food and fuel and machinery its enemy had built up and then walked away from. Not everything went to plan. The 1st Marines had been sent toward a grassy knoll that the maps placed a few easy miles south of the beach. It turned out to be the shoulder of Mount Austin, a 1,500-foot massif far to the southwest, walled off by miles of ravine and jungle. Colonel Cates could see at once that his men would never reach it, and that night the plan was quietly changed. It was the first lesson of many the island would teach. Here the ground was almost never where the map had promised it would be. The sky did not stay quiet for long. On that first afternoon, Japanese bombers came down from Rabaul, and again the following noon, a destroyer took a bomb and came away bloodied. One transport, the George F. Elliott, was set ablaze after a burning plane struck her, and she was run aground and left to burn on through the night. And a destroyer torpedoed in the bow, the Jarvis, limped away alone into the dark and was never seen again, gone, with every man aboard her. By the second evening, the beach had become a shambles of the fleet's own making. So much had been landed so fast that 100 loaded boats lay stranded on the sand, and 50 more waited beyond the surf with nowhere to put in. Out on the water, the transport still swung at anchor, half their cargo yet in their holds, working slowly through the night by the light of the burning Elliott. And beyond them, at the northwest mouth of the strait, the small dark cone of Savo Island stood against the last of the sky, as night came down over water that did not yet carry the name it would soon be given. Night came down over the anchorage the way it always did in the Solomons, quickly and without ceremony. All through the 8th of August, the transports had ridden at anchor off the beaches, boats shuttling back and forth in a tangle of cargo. And now the dark closed over the water, and the work went on by feel. Out beyond the ships on the seaward side, the Elliott was still burning, throwing her low red glow across the strait. No one thought much of it. A ship burning was a ship lost, and there were graver things to count. Far to the northwest, that same glow was being watched. Down the long channel that ran between the islands, the slot, the sailors would come to call it, 8 ships were coming south in line, fast and quiet, under a Japanese admiral named Gunichi Mikawa. He had gathered them at Rabaul and off Bougainville the moment the landings began. 5 heavy cruisers, the Chokai flying his flag, with the Aoba, the Kako, the Furutaka, the Kinugasa, 2 light cruisers and 1 old destroyer trailing behind. An American scout plane had seen them in daylight at 11:30 that morning, and had held them in view for the better part of an hour. But the sighting report wandered through the tangle of wartime radio and arrived hours late, robbed of its urgency. The ships guarding the strait never truly understood that anything was coming. Around 1 in the morning, a Japanese float plane droned unseen over the transport area and dropped a line of flares, large and blue-white, and strung out across the sky like a fence. The picket destroyers at the mouth of the strait did not find the column slipping past them in the dark. Mikawa's ships came through the gap by the little cone of Savo Island, sorted the anchored Allied cruisers out of the night one by one, and made ready to fire before anyone had spoken a word of warning. The word, when it came from a single destroyer. A little after 1:30, the Patterson broke the silence with a signal flung out over the radio to every ship that could hear. Warning, warning, strange ships entering harbor. It was already too late to matter much. The southern group of Allied cruisers took the first blow. The Australian cruiser Canberra, swinging to meet the threat, was hit again and again in a minute or two and left broken and burning in the water. Her captain, a man named Getting, was mortally wounded on his own bridge and died the next day. The American cruiser Chicago, torpedoed forward, turned away into the dark and fired into the night without ever finding a target. Then the column swung north, toward the second group. The Vincennes, the Quincy, the Astoria were steaming a slow square in the dark, at ease, half their men asleep. Searchlights snapped on across the water and pinned them one at a time, and the shells followed the light. In the first 2 or 3 minutes, all three were hit, and hit again, and set on fire. They fought back as best they could, a salvo here, a salvo there. Gun crews working by the light of their own burning ships. But the geometry of the thing had been decided before the first round. The Quincy went over and down before 3 in the morning. The Vincennes followed. The Astoria burned through the rest of the night and slipped under at midday, the last of them to go. The whole battle lasted little more than half an hour. When it was finished, 4 Allied cruisers were on the bottom of the strait or on their way there, and a 5th was limping off wounded. More than 1,000 sailors did not come back from that half hour. Men who had gone to sleep in a quiet anchorage and never fully woke. It was, by the plain arithmetic of ships and men, one of the worst defeats the United States Navy had ever suffered at sea. And it happened in waters so narrow that from the beach, in the morning, you could see where they had died. Mikawa did not press his luck. Behind him, unguarded now, lay the crowded transports, the whole reason for the landing, riding at anchor with almost nothing left to defend them. He might have turned and destroyed them. He did not. One American shell, in the middle of that short fight, had punched into the operations room of his own flagship Chokai and wrecked the charts and the instruments a night action is steered by. His formation was scattered across miles of dark water, and dawn was coming, and with the dawn, the American carriers he believed were still nearby. So he weighed the transports against the rising sun, and chose the sun, and turned north for home. It was a decision that would puzzle men for the rest of the war. The strait did not let him leave clean. 2 mornings later, a small, old American submarine lying off the islands to the north caught the cruiser Kako on the surface and sank her, and some 70 of Mikawa's sailors went down with her. That August, the strait still carried its gentle, ordinary name. Before the year was out, the men who fought over it would give it another one, for reasons that were only beginning that night to gather on its floor. By the morning of the 9th of August, a second decision was settling over the Marines, and this one they would feel for weeks. The 3 American carriers that had covered the landing had already asked, the evening before, to withdraw to the south. Their commander, Admiral Fletcher, gave his reasons plainly. His fuel was running low, and he had lost a fifth of his fighters. There were those who came to believe, later, that the deeper reason was a simple unwillingness to risk the carriers themselves, so close to the enemy's air. Whatever the weight of each, the carriers turned south and took the sky's protection with them. And so the transports could not stay. Without carriers overhead and without cruisers in the strait, Admiral Turner had no choice but to pull his ships out before the next nightfall. They got underway that afternoon, on the 9th, still crowded with cargo that had never reached the beach. Roughly half of what the Marines were meant to have was still in the holds when the anchors came up. By evening, the horizon was bare. The men on the beach stood among their unfinished stacks of supply and watched the last mast sink below the sea to the east, and then there was nothing out there at all. No ships, no smoke, only the flat, empty line of the water going gray. About 11,000 of them stood on Guadalcanal itself. Another 6,000 held the little islands across the strait, on Tulagi. Between them and the rest of the war lay a great deal of ocean and no one to cross it. They took stock of what the fleet had left them, and it was not much. They had the airfield the Japanese had nearly finished, and the Japanese food stacked beside it, rice mostly, and it would help keep the division fed for weeks to come. They had 18 rolls of barbed wire for the whole perimeter. They had their rifles and what they carried. What they did not have, they would have to build, or capture, or do without, and the first thing they meant to build was the airfield. Because an airfield, out here, was the only thing that could reach across all that empty water and bring the war back to them. The airfield was the reason for everything. The Japanese had chosen the ground for it, cleared it, and very nearly finished it. The Marines had walked across it almost without a fight on the second day of the landing, and found the runway lying there in the coconut groves, some 3,600 feet of it, waiting only for the last work to be done. Now, with the fleet gone and the strait lost, that unfinished strip became the single most valuable thing on the island. More valuable than the beach, more valuable than any hill. Whoever could fly from it would own the daylight over Guadalcanal. So on the 9th of August, the day the transport steamed away, the engineers went to work on it, and here the Marines had a stroke of luck they had done nothing to earn. When the Japanese construction crews fled into the hills, they had left their equipment behind, undamaged. Graders, rollers, dump carts, a narrow-gauge rail line for hauling fill. It was good machinery, most of it, and it still ran. The men who had come ashore with almost no heavy equipment of their own suddenly found themselves finishing a Japanese airfield with Japanese tools, filling the gap the enemy had left in the middle of the strip and packing the surface down hard. They had one machine of their own that mattered more than all the rest, a single bulldozer, an R4, small and overworked and irreplaceable. A corporal drove it from first light until it was too dark to see, day after day, grading the field and shoving fill into the low spots. When the air raid signal went up, he would keep working until the last moment, then run the dozer into cover, and when the bombs had walked across the strip and torn craters in it, he would come straight back out and fill them in before the next flight of aircraft needed to land. That one machine held the runway together for months. It finally shook itself to pieces near the end of October, having done the work of a company. There was fuel, too, waiting in the grass. 400 drums of Japanese aviation gasoline, laid in by the enemy for the very aircraft that were supposed to have flown from this field and had never come. The Marines would burn it in American engines instead. For a garrison living off what the departed fleet had managed to land, 400 drums of captured Avgas was not a detail. It was, for a while, the difference between an airfield and a bare strip of dirt. By the middle of the month, the runway was ready enough to name, and Vandegrift named it. He called it Henderson Field, for a Marine flyer named Lofton Henderson, a major who had led his dive bomber squadron against the Japanese carriers at Midway 2 months before and had not come back from the attack. It was a quiet kind of tribute, a strip of grated coral in a coconut grove, carrying the name of a man who had died 1,000 miles away, so that every pilot who landed there landed on his memory. For 11 days the field had a name and no aircraft. The Marines held an airfield they could not yet use, and overhead the Japanese bombers came almost daily from Rabaul, high up, methodical, drawing their lines across the sky. The Marines had brought their own answer to that, the 90mm anti-aircraft guns of the Defense Battalion, dug in around the field, which reached up and forced the bombers to climb to 25,000 feet. From that height, the bombing lost some of its accuracy, though never all of it, and the men on the ground learned the daily rhythm of the raids, the signal, the run for the holes, the wait, the return to work. Then, on the 20th of August, the field came alive. Far to the south, out over the sea, a small escort carrier called the Long Island had come north as close as she dared, and in the early afternoon she turned into the wind and launched her aircraft toward the island. 19 Wildcat fighters lifted off her deck under a Marine major named John L. Smith, and 12 dauntless dive bombers under a lieutenant colonel named Richard Mangrum, and they flew north across the empty water toward a strip of coral most of them had never seen. In the late afternoon, they came in over the trees and set down on Henderson Field, one after another, and the Marines came up out of their holes to watch them land. For the first time, the men on the ground had aircraft of their own overhead. It was a small force to hang so much upon. 31 aircraft, a major and a lieutenant colonel and their young pilots, flying from a single battered runway kept level by one bulldozer, and fueled in part from captured drums. But it was the beginning of something the men would come to call, half in affection and half in stubbornness, the Cactus Air Force. Cactus was the code name for Guadalcanal, and so the ragged, resupplied, endlessly patched together collection of aircraft that flew from Henderson Field for the rest of that autumn took its name from the island itself. Whatever squadrons came and went, whatever was lost and replaced, it was always the Cactus Air Force. And it had started with 31 planes on the 20th of August. Around the field lay the thing they were all there to protect, the perimeter. It was not a fortress. It was a long, flat oval of ground drawn around Henderson Field and the beach beyond it, anchored on the east against the sluggish creek the Marines called the Tenaroo, reaching west toward the Matanico, with the guns of the artillery regiment dug in on the high ground, south of the runway where they could reach out in any direction. The line was thin, and in places it was hardly a line at all, a string of positions with jungle between them, held by tired men with too little wire. But it had the airfield at its center, and the airfield was the point of the whole thing. The men who held that perimeter were learning to live inside it. They dug and redug their positions and filled what sandbags they had. The engineers rebuilt what the bombing knocked down. The gun crews learned the sky, and the pilots, in their first days on the field, went up to meet the raids that came down the slot and began, in small, hard fights high over the strait, to make the daylight their own. But an airfield draws more than aircraft. From the moment the Japanese understood what the Marines had taken, the field became the thing every enemy plan would aim at. The prize to be bombed from the air, shelled from the sea, and before long, stormed on the ground. The high command at Rabaul had already begun to move. The first troops meant to retake Guadalcanal were even then coming down the island chain by fast ship. A hard, confident force under a colonel who had never lost, bound for the very creek that guarded the eastern edge of the line. The men on the perimeter did not yet know they were coming, but the heart of the field was about to be fought over for the first time. The eastern edge of the perimeter rested on a creek. It was a slow, dark, brackish stream that ran the last few yards to the sea behind a bar of sand, and the Marines called it the Tenaroo, though that was not truly its name, and the real Tenaroo lay somewhere off to the east. Names ran together in that country. The creek was full of crocodiles, which is why an earlier hand had called it Alligator Creek, getting even the animal wrong. Whatever it was called, it was a good place to defend. Deep water, steep banks, a single narrow bar of sand at its mouth where a man could cross dry-shod. The Marines dug in along its western side and waited to find out what the island would send them. What the island sent them was a colonel named Kiyonao Ichiki and a body of soldiers who had never known defeat. They were the leading element of a detachment, about 900 men, drawn from a regiment that had been meant for Midway and turned back when that battle was lost. Their commander had been a soldier since the war with China began. His men had marched from victory to victory across the continent, and they had been told that the Americans on Guadalcanal were few and soft and would not stand. They came down the chain by fast destroyer and landed to the east of the perimeter on the 18th of August, and they set out for the airfield certain that a single hard blow would be enough. The Marines were not quite as blind as Ichiki believed. Days earlier, a British coast watcher named Martin Clemens had walked out of the hills and into the perimeter with a party of island scouts, bringing word that a new and different enemy was gathering to the east. And on the 19th, a Marine patrol under a captain named Charles Brush ran into a small party of Ichiki's men strung out along the coast. Engineers and officers laying communication wire, carrying, it turned out, detailed maps of the Marine positions. The patrol destroyed them. The maps told the rest of the story. Someone was coming in strength, and he knew exactly where the line was. But the warning that mattered most came from a single man, and he was neither a Marine nor a soldier. His name was Jacob Vusa. He was a sergeant major of the island constabulary, retired after a quarter-century in uniform, who had put his old authority back on to scout for the Marines. On the 18th of August, the Japanese caught him near his village, east of the perimeter, and found on him an American flag. They questioned him, and he would not answer. They bound him to a tree and questioned him again, and still he would not answer, and they left him for dead. He did not die. In the dark he worked himself free and made his way west through the enemy's own lines, mile after mile, until he reached the Marine positions at the mouth of the creek and gasped out his warning to the officers there, that the Japanese were massing, close and coming that night. Then he let them tend him. Years later, in a letter written long after the war, Vuza set down what that had cost and what it had not. "I stood up," he wrote, "and I went through the American line. Only 12 days I was in the hospital. And here I am, still alive, for the warning and the silence that bought it. His own people and the Americans alike would honor him for the rest of his life." He was one old man who had refused to speak to the enemy, and so became the first to speak to his friends. The night was well begun when it started. A little after 3 in the morning on the 21st of August, a sentry on the western bank heard movement across the water, in the dark, on the far side of the sandbar. A rustle, a shifting, the sound of men where there should have been none. He called out and got no answer, and fired. And then the far bank came apart in noise. Some 200 of Ichiki's men rose out of the dark and rushed the narrow sandbar in a column, straight at the center of the line, trusting to speed and shock to carry them across before the Marines could gather. They did not carry it. The men on the western bank had been warned, and they were ready, and the sandbar was a killing ground exactly a few yards wide. What followed in the dark was not a battle a man could see so much as one he could hear. The hammering of guns firing on fixed lines, the flat crack of artillery reaching in from the batteries south of the field, the shouting, the surf. Wave after wave came against the bar and against the surf line beside it, and the line bent and held, bent and held. The Marines could not make out much beyond the muzzle flashes and the shapes the flashes showed, but they held the western bank, and the creek stayed between them and the enemy could not get across it in strength. By the gray of early morning the attack had spent itself against the water, and Vandegrift moved to finish what the night had begun. He sent a battalion under a lieutenant colonel named Cresswell up the creek, well to the south, across the water where it could be crossed, and then swung it down the far bank. Behind Ichiki's men, and onto their flank, the Japanese who had spent the night trying to force the sandbar now found the creek at their back, and a fresh Marine line closing on them from the side, out of the trees. A few light tanks came across the bar and worked along the far shore. By late in the afternoon it was over. The fighting had lasted the better part of 16 hours. And it had all turned on a strip of water a boy could have waded. The arithmetic of it was stark. Of the roughly 900 men in Ichiki's leading detachment, barely 100 came through, a handful taken prisoner, a few slipping away into the hills, the rest lost on the sandbar and the banks, and in the trees where Cresswell's line had closed. The Marines who held the creek counted their own dead at 34, and their wounded at 75. Colonel Ichiki did not survive the destruction of his detachment. The manner of his end is uncertain, and the sources disagree, and it is enough to say that he did not outlast the men he had led across the water. It had been a strange, one-sided fight, and both sides read it in their own way. Ichiki had thrown a single battalion against a dug-in enemy he had been told was already beaten, and the creek had answered him. For the Marines it was a first proof that the line would hold, that these were not the Japanese of the beach on the 7th, the construction troops who had melted into the hills, but a real army now, and that a real army had come at the perimeter and been stopped at the water's edge. For the enemy, the lesson was larger and slower to learn, that Guadalcanal would not be taken by a single blow, that it would take numbers and time and a far heavier hand, and that hand was already gathering. Even as the creek fell quiet, Larger forces were being marshaled to come down the chain. Not a battalion this time, but a brigade, and not against the creek, but against the low, unnamed ridge that ran through the jungle south of the airfield, the last high ground before the runway itself. For now, though, the perimeter held, and the men along the creek slept where they could. September was coming, and with it the ridge. But that first night, the river had held the line. The battle at the Tanaroo, in the third week of August, had settled almost nothing, except one hard fact. A single battalion was not enough. Colonel Ichiki had thrown around 900 men against the perimeter, and lost nearly all of them in a night and a morning, and the officers who were planning the recapture of Guadalcanal from Rabaul drew the obvious lesson. If the Americans were to be pushed back into the sea, it would take a brigade, and a brigade was already on its way. Its commander was Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, and through the first days of September, his soldiers came ashore in the dark, a few hundred at a time, put down east and west of the perimeter by the fast destroyers that ran down the channel by night. Several thousand of them in the end, the survivors of Ichiki's detachment, folded in among fresh infantry regiments, gathered in the jungle beyond the marine wire, and began to move, not along the coast where the Marines were strongest and the guns of the perimeter could reach them, but inland to the south, through country that no map showed and no proper trail crossed, feeling their way toward the airfield from the one direction no one was watching. There was a ridge in that direction, a low spine of coral and kunai grass, a short mile south of the runway, running from the northwest to the southeast for perhaps 1,000 yards, with 4 short, distinct spurs branching off its flanks like the fingers of a spread hand. It had no name. On the American maps it was nothing at all. A wrinkle in the green, one fold of ground among 1,000 identical folds, but it rose out of the jungle just where the jungle opened toward Henderson Field, and a single narrow road tied its foot to the airfield behind. Whoever held that ridge looked straight down the throat of the runway. If you had walked its crest by daylight in the second week of September, you would have seen nothing to fight over. Grass moving in the heat, the dark wall of the jungle below, and a mile off to the north, the flat scar of the airstrip with its planes coming and going. It did not look like the most important ground on the island. It was. It was the keystone of the whole position, the one stone that held the arch. Leave it, and an army could climb it in the dark and be on the airfield by morning. Pull it out, and everything the Marines had bled for since August came down with it. One man had read it that way. Colonel Merritt Edson read Mike to the Marines, a lean, quiet, sandy-haired officer who commanded the 1st Raider Battalion, looked at that ridge and saw in it the single open door to the airfield from the south, and he asked to stand in the doorway. His raiders were tired men. So were the paratroopers attached to them, who had already fought hard on the little islands across the Sound back in the first days of August. He took them up onto the ridge anyway and set his line along its spine, because he was nearly certain that this was where Kawaguchi would come. On the night of the 12th, the jungle in front of the ridge came alive. Japanese patrols probed the line in the dark, testing it, feeling along it for a seam. Here a burst of fire, and there a rush that faded back into the black before it closed. It was a rehearsal, and the men on the ridge understood it as one. Nobody on that high ground slept much. Through the day that followed, Edson quietly shortened his line. He drew his forward companies back off the outer spurs, and pulled the whole defense in tighter onto the high ground, trading distance for density. Better a short line held hard than a long one held thin. He had perhaps 800 men to hold it, 2 understrength companies of paratroopers, a company of raiders, the rest scattered in strong points out in the trees. Behind them, back toward the airfield, the battalions of the 5th Marines waited in reserve in the dark, listening. The real attack came with the night of the 13th. Around 9, a Japanese warship offshore opened up, its shells walking across the ridge from the sea. And behind that curtain the infantry came, out of the ravines and the black jungle on the ridge's southern flank, in 3 great pushes spread across the hours of darkness. Flares drifted down on their little parachutes and lit the grass a swaying milky white. The Marines on the forward spur were pressed back, and back again, the line bending northward along the spine toward the last low knoll before the airfield. Small groups held and gave ground and held again in the noise and confusion, falling from spur to spur, until the fight had closed in tight around that final rise. Edson stood his last line there, on the last knoll, with the airfield a mile at his back and nowhere further to go. And through the worst of it, he walked that line upright, close enough to the front that the men could see him in the flare light, steadying the whole thing simply by being visible when everything else had come apart. Word of where he stood ran along the ridge faster than any order. Toward 4 in the morning, with the left flank ragged and coming apart, the reserve companies of the 5th Marines were fed up the road and into the line piece by piece in the full dark. No light to move by, no clear picture of where the enemy was, or where their own men were. Only the shape of the ridge under their boots and the voices along it. Behind them, the division's own guns, the artillery of the 11th Marines, walled the ridge in fire, dropping their shells so close to the crest that the men on it felt the ground jump beneath them. The line bent. It did not break, and slowly, as the sky to the east began to gray, the pressure eased. The attackers had spent themselves against that last knoll and could not carry it. When the light came up on the 14th of September, the ridge was still in Marine hands, and at last it had a name. The men who had held it called it Bloody Ridge. In time it would be Edson's Ridge for the colonel who had chosen the ground and stood on it. Among those who had fought along its spine, 31 Marines had been killed, 103 wounded, and 9 were missing. Out on the slopes and in the grass in front of the line, the cost had fallen far heavier. Hundreds of Japanese dead lay where the attack had reached its high water mark, and the Japanese command would afterward reckon its losses in the fighting at around 1,500 men. Kawaguchi's brigade, which had crossed all those trackless miles to take the airfield from the blind side, drew back broken into the hills. The medal Edson was given for those 2 nights, the Medal of Honor, sets them down in the flat, formal language of a citation. Extraordinary heroism. On the night of the 13th to 14th of September, 1942, 800 men holding a ridge above the jungle before the airfield, a line skillfully drawn back and personally led against, in the citation's own words, a fanatical foe of greatly superior numbers. Behind that language lies a simpler thing. A nameless fold of ground the map makers had passed over had turned out to hold the whole campaign together, and 800 tired men had stood on it 2 nights running and refused to give it up. The keystone held, and a mile to the north, in the wet gray dawn, the airstrip went on breathing, its engines turning over, its planes lifting off into the murk, kept alive by a ridge that, a week before, had not been worth the ink to name. After the ridge for a while, the big attacks stopped. Kawaguchi's brigade had pulled back into the hills, and the next great effort against the airfield would not come until October. Into the space that opened, on the plain around Henderson Field, something settled that was neither peace nor battle. It was routine. The men of the perimeter dug in along the tenor route to the east and out toward the Matnikau in the west. The guns behind them, the airfield at the heart of it all, woke each morning to the same island they had woken to the day before, and set about, slowly making a life inside it. A strange life, on short rations and bad ground, but a life with a shape. Food was the first fact of it. The 2 meals a day the division had been on since August held for about 6 weeks more, and the mainstay of both, right into the first days of November, was captured Japanese rice, great stores of it, taken along with the airfield in the first hours ashore. The men grew wearily, intimately familiar with it. Rice at morning, rice again at dusk, rice that as often as not came with weevils cooked into it, which a hungry man learned to look past. Around it they built what they could, coconuts knocked down from the old plantation trees, taro dug out of island gardens, canned fish from the same Japanese stores, and for those lucky enough to find it, captured Japanese beer and sake, warm and odd and very welcome. Nobody grew fat. Most of these men had lost weight they could not spare before the ridge was ever fought, and they went on quietly losing it. Then there was the rain, and the mud that was its child. On Guadalcanal the seasons were only degrees of wet, and the afternoon downpours would fill a foxhole nearly as fast as a man could dig it. Boots stayed wet. Feet stayed wet, soft and pale and wrinkled inside leather that never quite dried either. Uniforms rotted gently on the body. The red mud worked its way into rifles and rations and the folds of everything, and the men made a sour running joke of it. Because the alternative to joking about the mud was thinking about the other thing. The thing that was putting more of them out of action than the Japanese were. For the real enemy of the perimeter was not a man at all. It was the mosquito. Malaria moved through the camps all through the autumn, quiet and patient and relentless, and the count of the sick ran into the thousands. By the time the whole campaign was over, the fever would take more Marines out of the line than every bullet and shell on the island combined. There was a defense against it, a small, bitter, canary yellow tablet called atabrine, handed out by the corpsmen, and swallowed faithfully, some genuine protection. But a rumor went around the tents that the yellow pill left a man sterile, that it would cost him someday the children he meant to go home to. And so, again and again, a Marine would take the tablet from the corpsman, wait for his back to turn, and spit it into the mud. They chose the fever over the rumor. It is one of the quiet human facts of that island. An army that would hold a ridge against anything, quietly refusing the medicine that might have saved it, out of fear of a thing it could not see. And then there were the nights, which had a whole cast of their own. Regular visitors the men came to know so well that they gave them names. The way you name a thing you cannot get rid of. There was Washing Machine Charlie, a lone Japanese plane that came droning over Henderson Field after dark. Its engines run deliberately out of time with each other, so that the sound rose and fell in a lopsided mechanical churn. Exactly like a washing machine turning over in the next room. It dropped few bombs. What it robbed was sleep, holding a whole airfield flat in its holes, listening. There was Louis the Louse, a float plane that slipped over at night to hang a flare above the perimeter, lighting the ground a cold white, often the men learned, so that something heavier could see to aim. And there was Pistol Pete, not one gun but several. Japanese field pieces trundled up through the jungle from the west and hidden, that lobbed their shells onto the airstrip from somewhere out of sight and would not be found. Behind all of them, out on the dark water, was the thing that kept the enemy on the island fed. Almost every night, fast Japanese destroyers came running down the long channel between the island chains, the stretch of water the Americans called the slot. Loaded with soldiers and supplies, they would put their cargo ashore somewhere west of the perimeter in a few swift hours, and be gone north again before the sun could bring the plains of Henderson Field out after them. The Marines named it with the tired humor they named everything, the Tokyo Express. It ran on a schedule as regular as a railway. Its trains were warships, and the man who drove it best was a Japanese rear admiral named Raizo Tanaka. Night after night it came and went, and by day the sea lay empty and blue and innocent, as though nothing had crossed it at all. Between the fever and the night visitors, the men held on to the small things. Mail, when it came in on the transports, mattered more than all the rest. Letters read and folded and read again, kept dry in whatever would keep them dry. Coffee, hot and bitter, brewed over a low fire between alerts. A rumor that the war was going well somewhere else. They wrote home that they were fine, because what else does a man write? And in the sense that counted, they were. Still there, still holding. One more day crossed off. The war had quietly become their daily life, and daily life, even here, found room for coffee and letters, and the endless joke about the mud. But lying awake under washing machine Charlie's off-key drone, the men had begun to understand something. The island would not be decided on the island alone. Whoever owned that dark water off the coast, the water the Tokyo Express crossed so freely every single night, would in the end own Guadalcanal. And out there, in the nights that were coming, that water was about to start changing hands. At night, when the engines of the lone plane overhead finally faded and the airfield went quiet, a man in a foxhole near the beach could hear the other sound that never stopped on Guadalcanal. The slow wash of the sea against the sand, a few dozen yards away in the dark. It was the most ordinary sound in the world, and the water it came from belonged, depending on the hour, to two different navies. By day, the sea off Lunga Point was American water. The plains of the field owned the sky above it, and no Japanese captain in his right mind would bring a ship down the channel in daylight to be found by the dive bombers. But when the sun went down behind Cape Esperance, the daylight rules went down with it. In the darkness, the fast ships came south, and for a few hours the sea changed hands. They came down the slot, that long straight channel running the spine of the Solomons from the Japanese bases in the north to the waters off Guadalcanal, the Tokyo Express's own road, run nightly and hunted by day. And down the slot now and then came something a great deal heavier. The name these waters are remembered by came later, and it came from what happened in them. Before the war, the 20-mile sound between Guadalcanal and Florida Island had been called Savo Sound, after the little cone-shaped island at its northwestern mouth. But by the autumn of 1942, so many ships, American, Australian, Japanese, had already gone to the bottom, sir, and so many more still would, that the sailors gave the sound a grimmer name, and it stuck. They called it Iron Bottom Sound. Through that October, the Iron Bottom was still filling. On the night of the 11th of October, the Americans decided to fight for the darkness for once. A cruiser force under Rear Admiral Norman Scott, 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers, moved up toward Savo in the black early hours to intercept a Japanese squadron coming down to shell the field. What followed was one of the first times the Americans caught the Japanese by surprise at night. And radar was the reason. At 25 minutes before midnight, the radar aboard one of Scott's cruisers found something out to the northwest, more than 27,000 yards away. A contact in the dark long before any lookout could have seen it. A minute later, another set of screens found 3 shapes closer in. A few minutes more, and a third ship reported objects some 14,000 yards off. The enemy was there, in the blackness, exactly where the instrument said, and did not yet know he had been seen. Just before 1:45, one cruiser asked permission to open fire, and then simply opened it. The others followed within seconds. Scott's line had crossed ahead of the Japanese column. Crossing the T, the gunners called it, the oldest advantage in naval battle. Every American gun able to fire down the length of an enemy who could barely reply. For a few minutes, the darkness off Cape Esperance came apart in muzzle flashes and falling shells. In the confusion, and it was confusion, ships firing on their own consorts, gunners calling targets by silhouette on a night with no moon. The exact accounting would take years to sort out. What is certain is that in the short fight, the Japanese lost a heavy cruiser and a destroyer, and lost 2 more destroyers the next morning to the planes from the field, which found them still in the area at first light. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, was struck down on his own bridge in the opening minutes, mortally wounded by the fire of an enemy he had not known was there. Something like 500 Japanese sailors did not come home from that night. It was not a clean victory. Scott lost a destroyer, the Duncan, caught between the 2 fleets and burning. A cruiser and another destroyer were badly hurt, some of it by American shells in the dark. Perhaps 150 to 200 American sailors were killed. But for the men on the island waking to the news that for once the night battle had gone their way, Cape Esperance was a rare and welcome thing. The sea, just this once, had stayed theirs after dark. It did not last. The Japanese answer came 2 nights later, and it was the worst night the airfield would ever know. On the night of the 13th of October, down the slot came the 2 things the field feared most. Not cruisers this time, but battleships. The Congo and the Haruna, screened by a light cruiser and a line of destroyers, came into the Sound with a specific and unusual mission, not to fight ships, but to destroy an airfield. Their magazines were loaded with bombardment shells, fused to burst against targets on the ground, and there were nearly 1,000 of them in the 2 ships' 14-inch guns. Sometime after 1 in the morning, a flare drifted down over Henderson Field, hung there in the dark, and lit the runway for the gunners out in the Sound. Then the first salvo came in. For a little over an hour, the men who lived through it would never agree on the exact minutes, only that it did not stop. The battleships walked their fire up and down the field. Almost 1,000 14-inch shells came down in that time, each one the weight of a small car, each fused to throw steel across the open ground where the aircraft stood. Men pressed themselves into slit trenches and dugouts, and the wet earth, and waited for it to end. And it went on, and on. The ground did not stop trembling for the whole of it. Years afterward, the survivors would say the night itself seemed to shake. When the guns finally fell silent and the ships turned back up the slot before the dawn could find them, the field took stock. Of the 90-odd aircraft of the Cactus Air Force, 48 were destroyed. Much of the aviation gasoline had burned. 41 men were dead. 6 of them air crew, and by first light there was, on the whole island, a single dive bomber still fit to fly. And yet, and this has to be said plainly, the strip held. The runway was cratered and the wreck smoked along its edges, but ground crews were out filling holes before the last shells had cooled, and flying shifted to a rough new fighter strip nearby. And within days, the field was in the air again. The battleships had done everything 2 capital ships could do to a patch of coral in a single night. And in the morning the heart was still beating. The bombardment had a purpose beyond punishment. It was cover. While the 14-inch shells were coming down and the field lay stunned, a Japanese convoy was landing troops on the beaches west of the perimeter. Some 4,500 fresh soldiers, with artillery and anti-aircraft guns, put ashore in the dark beneath the umbrella of those guns. It was Tanaka's Express, doing what it did best, and through that October, his ships kept coming. Every night the sea changed hands, and every night it left something new on the beaches to the west. By the end of that week, both the men inside the perimeter and the men landing beyond it had come to understand where this was going. Whatever came next would come on foot, and out past the western beaches, in the black wall of the jungle. It was already gathering. The soldiers who were meant to take the airfield never fought the battle their generals had drawn on the map. The jungle fought them first. The plan was bold on paper. General Masao Maruyama's Sendai Division, the 2nd Division, reinforced to some 7,000 men, would not attack the perimeter where it was strong, along the rivers and the beaches where the Marines were dug in and waiting. Instead, the whole division would disappear into the interior, cut a secret trail south of the American line, swing wide around the back of Mount Austin, and come at the airfield from the south, out of the jungle where no one was looking. To do it, they had to build a road that did not exist. Engineers went ahead, hacking a path deeper into the island than even the island's own people had trails. 35 miles of it, and perhaps 15 of those miles through the worst jungle any of them had ever seen. Trees too big to reach around, walls of vine, slopes so slick with rain that a man went up them on his hands, rivers to be forded and ravines to be climbed down into and hauled back out of. They called it the Maruyama Road. It was less a road than a rumor of one. The men who marched it carried almost nothing, and it was still too much. Each soldier went in on half rations of raw rice. Cooking fires were forbidden, because a column of smoke over the ridges would give the whole secret away. And on top of his own pack and rifle and ration, every man was ordered to carry, by the account that survives, a single artillery shell. One shell, over and above everything else, hand-carried 35 miles through the mud, so that the guns would have something to fire when they arrived. The guns never arrived. By the 4th day, the trail behind the division was littered with the things men could no longer carry: machine guns, mortars, boxes of ammunition, set down in the mud and left where they lay. The artillery, broken down into pieces to be hand-carried, was abandoned piece by piece along the track. The timetable came apart with it. A march meant to take a few days took far longer, and the attack that was supposed to open on one night had to be pushed back, and pushed back again, while the men grew hungrier. and the officers waited for whole regiments still lost somewhere back in the trees. The Sendai Division reached the country below the airfield a day late, exhausted and half-starved. The island had beaten the plan before the first shot was fired. Waiting for them, though no one on the American side knew exactly where the blow would fall, was a thin line on a ridge south of the field. The sector belonged to a single Marine battalion, the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines, under a lieutenant colonel. The whole corps would come to know by one word: Chesty Puller. His companies were spread along the high ground, one on each flank and one holding the saddle between. A few hundred men holding a front far too long for their numbers, staring into the black jungle on the nights at the end of October, when the attacks came out of the dark, wave after wave, thrown against the wire in the rain across the nights of the 24th and 25th. The line bent and held and called for help, and the help that came was, in its own quiet way, a piece of history. Fed forward by companies in the pitch dark came the 3rd Battalion of the 164th Infantry, soldiers of the United States Army, of the American Division, National Guardsmen from the Dakotas. It was the first time on Guadalcanal that Marines and Army fought a battle side by side, mixed together along the same ridge on the same night, and between them they held it. By morning, the ground in front of the line was carpeted with the Sendai Division's dead. 2 men from that ridge would carry the Medal of Honor out of those nights, and their citations are worth more than the legends that later grew over them. One was a sergeant named John Basilone of Puller's battalion, in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns in the Lunga area on the 24th and 25th of October. His citation records it plainly. As the assault came on and one of his gun sections was put out of action, leaving only 2 men able to fight, Basilone moved another gun into position and put it into action. Under continual fire, he repaired a second and manned it himself, and later, with ammunition critically low and the supply line cut, he battled his way through the enemy positions to bring shells back to his gunners. That is what is documented, and it is enough. The more colorful stories that gathered around his name afterward belong to legend, not to the record. And the record needs no help. The other was a platoon sergeant named Mitchell Page of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines, on the night the enemy broke through the line directly in front of his position. His citation describes a machine gun section that fought until every man in it was killed or wounded, and Page alone moving from gun to keep them firing, taking over a second when the first was destroyed, never ceasing his fire. And then, when help at last reached him, forming a new line and leading a bayonet charge that drove the enemy back and closed the gap before it could open. Between the 2 of them, across 2 nights on one ridge, the door to the airfield stayed shut. While the ridge was holding, another battle was being fought over the horizon that the men in the mud never saw. A battle of aircraft carriers, 300 miles out to sea, near the Santa Cruz Islands. On the morning of the 26th of October, Japanese planes found the American carrier Hornet and worked her over. A bomb into the flight deck, a burning plane into her funnel, 2 torpedoes into her engine rooms, until by mid-morning she lay dead in the water. Through the day the attacks came back. Her crew fought to save her and could not. Her captain finally gave the order to abandon ship, and American destroyers, unable to sink her cleanly, left her to the Japanese destroyers that came up in the night and finished her. On paper, it was a Japanese victory. The Hornet was gone, the last American fleet carrier ever sunk by enemy fire in the whole war. and the one other carrier in those waters, the Enterprise, limped away damaged, so that for a while the United States had not a single fully fit carrier left anywhere in the Pacific. But the Japanese had bought the day at a price they could not pay twice. Dozens of their finest carrier aircrews, the veterans of a year of victories, went down into the sea, and those men could not be replaced. And for all of it, for the Hornet, for the long grim tally out beyond the horizon, the one thing the whole battle had been fought over did not change. The airfield held. The strip was still there in the morning and still flying. For the Sendai Division there was nothing left but to go back the way they had come. Of the 7,000 who had marched into the jungle to take the field from the south, only about 1,000 came back out along that terrible trail. The rest were lost on the ridge, or in the ravines, or simply somewhere in the green, beaten as much by the 35 miles, and the raw rice and the abandoned guns as by the men on the line. The jungle had eaten the plane, and then it had eaten most of the army that carried it. And so, as October ended, both sides came slowly to the same hard conclusion. The field could not be bombed into silence, and it could not be shelled into silence. And now it had been proven that it could not be stormed by an army that walked in through the jungle. Whoever meant to win this island would have to do it the plainest way of all, by putting more men and more guns ashore than the other side could, and doing it faster. The next move would not be a patrol, or a raid, or a secret trail. It would be a convoy, and both navies, north and south of Iron Bottom Sound, were already loading one. By the end of October, both sides had reached for the same idea at the same time. The land attacks had failed, the airfield had held, and each of the two commands looked at the map and decided that the matter would be settled by ships. In the anchorages to the north, the Japanese gathered transports and warships to carry a fresh division down the slot and end the campaign in one blow. To the south, the Americans gathered cruisers and destroyers to stop them. For 5 days in the middle of November, the 11th through the 15th of 1942, those two gatherings collided in the dark water between Guadalcanal and Savo, and afterward the naval histories would call those 5 days the turning point of the whole campaign. Think of it as 3 nights on a set of scales. On one side, the last great effort of the Japanese fleet. On the other, everything the Americans had left to put in the pan against it. Between the two, a narrow strip of sea where so much steel had already gone down since August that men compared it, without exaggeration, to the great battles of the last war. 3 times over 5 days the scales would tip and settle. And when they finally came to rest, the island would no longer be seriously in doubt. The first night was the worst kind of fighting there is. A close-range collision in near total darkness. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan led 13 ships into the Sound just after midnight on Friday the 13th of November. 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, in a single long column, moving at 18 knots with the moon already down, and the sky heavy with cloud. His flag flew on the heavy cruiser San Francisco. The second-ranking admiral, Norman Scott, rode ahead on the light cruiser Atlanta. Against them, somewhere in the black, came a Japanese force built around 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, that had come to shell the airfield, not to fight a surface action at all. Radar found the enemy a little after 1 in the morning, but the 2 forces closed faster than orders could travel. The American column drove straight in between 2 separate Japanese groups, so that by the time the first searchlight snapped on the fleet, was already tangled together. Callahan gave the order as the guns opened. Odd ships fired to starboard, even ships to port, and after that there was very little that anyone could control. Ships fired at shapes. Sometimes the shapes were their own. The whole thing lasted about 34 minutes, at ranges that now and then fell below 2,000 yards, closer than two ships should ever willingly be. In that tangle, both American admirals were killed. Scott died early when a salvo caught Atlanta from close aboard. Shells, it turned out, loaded with green dye, the marking color of San Francisco herself, so that the ship that fired may well have been a friend. Not long after, San Francisco found herself dueling the battleship Hiei almost muzzle to muzzle, and the battleship's third salvo swept her bridge and killed Callahan where he stood. To lose the commander and his second in the same short fight was a thing the naval service almost never suffered. Both men would receive the Medal of Honor, posthumously, and the fleet that morning was left, for a few hours, leaderless on the water. The cost of that first night was heavy and one-sided seeming and yet not final. 2 cruisers gone, Atlanta and Juno, 4 destroyers gone with them, but the battleship Hiei, hammered again and again in the dark, was left circling northwest of Savo by dawn, with her steering wrecked and a crippled battleship in daylight. Within reach of the airfield was a battleship already half lost. One of the ships from that night deserves a quiet moment of its own. The light cruiser Juno had been torpedoed during the battle and had pulled out of the fight, limping south on a single shaft with the other damaged ships. The next morning, the 13th, a second torpedo found her in almost the same place, and she broke in two and was gone in about 20 seconds. Of a crew of nearly 700, only around 10 men lived. Among those lost were 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. The 5 Sullivan brothers who had asked to serve together and had. And all 5 died that day. It remains the greatest loss a single American family has suffered in war. A destroyer was later named for them, and it still carries their name. The Sullivans. The daylight between the first night and the last belonged to the airplanes. All through the 13th, the crippled Hiei was worked over by torpedo planes and bombers from the airfield and from the carrier offshore. Attack after attack across the whole day, until by evening she was still afloat, but only just. Sometime in the night she vanished. In the morning there was nothing on the water where she had been but an oil slick 2 or 3 miles long. However exactly she went down, the fact was plain enough. Hiei was the first battleship the Japanese Navy lost in the entire war, and she was lost here. Then came the transports. On the 14th, Admiral Tanaka brought a convoy toward the island. A dozen transports loaded with troops, thousands of men, though the estimates of how many ran wildly apart, from a few thousand in the captured papers to a whole division in the fears of the American command. It hardly mattered in the end because the airfield's planes spent the entire day tearing the convoy apart in the open sea. By nightfall, most of it was gone. Some ships sunk outright, others burned to the waterline, and the last 4 driven to run themselves aground on the beach to the west, rather than sink in deep water. The men who had crossed all that distance would reach the island, if at all, with nothing. The last night was the cleanest, and it was decided by radar. Rear Admiral Willis Lee brought in 2 battleships of his own, Washington, wearing his flag, and South Dakota, with 4 destroyers. Just after midnight on the 15th, Washington opened fire on the leading Japanese ship from more than 18,000 yards, tracking it by radar before the enemy had lit a light or fired a shot, and her first salvo landed square. When the Japanese finally switched on their searchlights and caught South Dakota, which had lost power aft and stood exposed and blazing under a concentration of fire, Washington quietly shifted her main battery onto the battleship Kirishima at close range. What followed took about 5.5 minutes. In that time, Washington fired 75 rounds from her great guns into Kirishima and left the enemy battleship burning and mortally wounded. She would sink before the night was out. Washington herself was not touched once in the entire action. South Dakota, badly battered, with 30 men dead and twice that many hurt, held together because her armor held, and steamed away under her own power. And on the morning of the 15th, the 4 beach transports at Tassafaronga were finished off at leisure, by aircraft, by shore batteries, and by a single American destroyer that stood off the sand and fired into them at leisure, in complete command of water where, a few hours before, enemy battleships had steamed. That was the third weighing, and it settled the scales for good. Never again in the 3 months that remained would the Japanese attempt to throw so heavy a threat at the island. The men on the beach did not know the full accounting yet, but something had changed in the Sound, and it would not change back. On the 9th of December, the watch changed. Major General Alexander Patch, who had brought the American Division to the island, took over command from General Vandegrift, and on that very same day, the first ship stood out of the Sound carrying the Marines who had held the perimeter since August. 3 vessels loaded the 5th Marines and turned for Australia, and by the end of the month, the whole of the 1st Marine Division was gone, sent away to rest and refit after 4 months that had used them up. They left as a division that had won and been worn hollow at once. From the 7th of August to the 10th of December, it had lost more than 600 men killed, but its total roll of losses ran past 10,000, and of those, only about 1,500 were from enemy fire. The rest was fever. Nearly 6,000 cases of malaria, better than 3,000 in November alone, had done what the enemy could not, thinning the ranks quietly and steadily. Almost every man had lost weight. They had earned the ships that carried them out. Patch's task was set out plainly: to clear the island of every Japanese soldier still on it. The force he inherited to do it was, by now, the larger one. Where the Marines were leaving, 3 fresh formations were arriving to build an army corps around them. The American Division, the 25th Infantry Division under General Lawton Collins, and the 2nd Marine Division. By the first week of January, there were better than 40,000 Americans on the island, against fewer than 25,000 Japanese, who were, themselves, sick and short of everything. But the last stretch of high ground still had to be taken foot by foot, and its center was a ridge called Mount Austin. It stood a few miles southwest of the airfield, tall enough that a Japanese observer on its crest could watch the bombers lift off and warn the bases to the north. It had to be cleared before any general advance west could begin, and the fight for it turned into one of the hardest and least remembered actions of the whole campaign. Near the top of it lay a position the defenders had named the Gifu, after a home prefecture on the main island of Japan, the way men will give the name of home to the place they expect to die. It was a horseshoe of about 45 log pillboxes, dug in low and set to cover one another, roofed with layered timber and standing less than a meter above the ground, almost invisible in the dark forest until a man was on top of one. Perhaps 500 soldiers held it. It took the Americans more than a month and 5 infantry battalions to reduce that single strong point. The arithmetic of it tells the story better than any adjective. One regiment spent 22 days on Mount Austin, took Hill 27 in the first days of January, and came off the line worn down as much by fever and dysentery as by the fighting. Behind the infantry, the artillery grew methodical and overwhelming. On one January morning, the guns put more than 5,000 rounds into a single draw in half an hour, the heaviest such concentration the Army had yet massed in the war. And still the log pillboxes of the Gifu held, because they were low and mutually covering and manned by men who did not intend to leave. In the end, it was broken almost by accident. On the 22nd of January, a single light tank, crewed by scouts, ground its way through the position in a few hours and tore open a gap 200 yards wide in a line that had turned back infantry for a month. The senior officer had already slipped away toward the coast, ordering the garrison to filter out and save itself. But a major named Inagaki and the starving men around him chose to stay, to die at their posts rather than abandon the sick and the wounded who could not move. On the night that followed, they made a last attack into the dark. In the morning, the Americans counted the fallen before their line, the major among them, and the Gifu was still at last. Mount Austin was clear. There is one more enemy on this island that has to be named plainly, and it belongs to the other side, to the Japanese soldiers who fought and died here. Guadalcanal had become, in their own words, the island of hunger. The reason was in the sea and the sky above it. American aircraft had made the water impassable to supply, and food simply stopped arriving. So the last months of the Japanese army here were not, for most of its men, a matter of battle at all. It was a matter of running out. This is a thing to set down carefully as a fact and a measure, not a scene. Of the more than 36,000 Japanese who fought on the island, some 9,000 died of disease and starvation, apart from all those killed in the fighting. In the worst weeks of December, the toll from hunger alone was reckoned in the scores each day. The men who kept diaries wrote of measuring how long a body had left by the signs of its wasting. These were soldiers who had come to this place under orders, with the same hopes and the same fear of dying far from home as the men on the ridges opposite them, and a great many of them did die far from home, not to a bullet, but to an empty supply line and a closed sea. That is the shape of the change in watch. The Marines who had held the perimeter went out to their ships, sick and thin and victorious. A fresh army came in to finish the ground, and across the lines, in the wet forest above the beaches, a last enemy that neither side had chosen was doing the work that neither army needed to do. Quietly and without a shot. By the turn of the year, the men in Tokyo had done the arithmetic too, and reached the answer the island had been writing for months. After every failed attack and every lost convoy, the High Command decided to let Guadalcanal go. 50,000 fresh soldiers had been gathered up at Rabaul to save it, and could not be landed. At the end of December, the losses in ships were enough. The counteroffensive was called off, and the order went out to take off the survivors and hold the next island up the chain instead. They meant to do it quietly, and they nearly did. To cover the withdrawal, the Japanese stepped up their air attacks on the airfield and even put a small force ashore near Cape Esperance, so that everything on the surface looked like the opening of another push onto the island rather than the end of one. Then, on 3 separate nights in the first days of February, destroyers came down the slot to the Cape and took the living away, packed aboard, several hundred to a ship, and gone before daylight could catch them. The sick and the naval troops first, then the headquarters and the divisions, and last of all the rest. It was the Tokyo Express run in reverse. The same fast destroyers that had spent half a year carrying men down to the island now carried them off it, on the same dark schedule, for the same reason, to be finished before the sun and the airplanes could interfere. How many they took away is one of those numbers the sources cannot agree on. The American estimates at the time ran anywhere from 3,000 to 9,000, while the count made in Japan after the war put it near 13,000. Somewhere in that range, a starving army slipped off the island in the dark, and the men waiting to destroy it never saw it go. That was the strange part, and it was nobody's fault exactly. General Patch was expecting a landing, not a departure, bracing for the next attack, not watching for an exit. Admiral Halsey had massed 6 naval task forces south of the island in those days, battleships and carriers, ready for a fight that never came. And at the one moment when aerial photographs of Cape Esperance might have told the Americans what was really happening, the new photo reconnaissance unit could not develop them. It had arrived without the right filters and the right paper, and so the pictures that would have shown the beaches emptying simply could not be made. The evidence was there in the sky and could not be brought to the ground. So the end, when it came, was quiet. On the 9th of February, 2 American columns closing along the coast, one from the east, one landed to the west, met near a village close to Cape Esperance in the late afternoon and found the organized fighting over. Only stragglers were left. That evening, Patch signaled Halsey with the news, in words that have lasted, the total and complete defeat of the Japanese on Guadalcanal. He wrote, was effected. The Tokyo Express no longer had a terminus on Guadalcanal. Halsey wired back in the same dry spirit, saying that when he had sent Patch out he had not expected him to relieve the enemy of his pants so quickly, and thanking and congratulating him. After 6 months, the campaign had a last sentence, and it was almost cheerful. The bill for it should be read slowly and on both sides, because the whole meaning of the place is in the size of it. On the ground, the Americans had put some 60,000 soldiers and Marines through the island over the campaign, and of those, on the order of 1,600 were killed, and several thousand more wounded. Out at sea, in the November nights and all the others, the Navy's losses ran into the thousands of men, whole crews going down in minutes in the Sound. The Japanese count was heavier and harder to fix. Set every source beside every other and the total shift, but the shape does not. Of the men Japan sent to this island, something over 20,000, and by some reckonings a good deal more, did not leave, and hunger and sickness, as you have heard, claimed very nearly as many of them as the fighting did. And in the air and on the water, Japan had lost more than 600 aircraft with their crews, and ships she could not replace, a loss that would tell on every operation still to come. That is the last line of the bill, and it is the line the whole story has been moving toward. Guadalcanal was the first offensive of the Pacific War, the first time the Americans had taken ground and held it and pushed the enemy off it. And it was the place where the long tide of Japanese advance was finally stopped. Before this island, Japan had come forward and forward, month after month, toward the sea lanes that linked America to Australia. After this island, for the rest of the war, she would mostly be defending. The initiative had changed hands here, in the fever and the mud and the dark water, and it would not change back. And then the noise stopped. The convoys stopped coming down the slot. The guns on the ridges went quiet, and the last stragglers slipped away into the hills, and the sound between the island and Savo lay still under the sun. For 6 months, this had been the loudest place in the world. The airfield, the shell fire, the ships breaking apart in the night. Now the rain came down on the coconut groves as it always had, and the tide moved over the wrecks on the bottom, and the island began very slowly to grow quiet again. That quiet is still there, and it is worth going once to stand on the high ground above the water and listen to it. Come back to the island one last time, not to any date in particular now, just the island itself at night as it always is. The rain still builds over the mountains in the afternoon, the way it did before anyone named them. It still comes down the green slopes toward evening and moves out over the water. And when it passes, the air smells of wet earth and copra and the sea. The jungle took back the trails long ago. The kunai grass moves on the ridgelines in the night wind, exactly as it moved under the flares. And the crocodiles still keep their slow watch in the lagoons. And the surf comes in over the reef at Lunga Point with the same unhurried breath it has kept for 10,000 years. There is a capital city on the island now, Honiara, lights strung along the shore where the supply dumps and the tent camps were, fishing boats riding at anchor in the dark. The airfield the engineers finished with one bulldozer and captured Japanese trucks is an international airport today. Airliners let down over Lunga Point in the evening, wheels reaching for the same strip of ground that wildcats once reached for at dusk, out of fuel, out of daylight, home. Most of the passengers never know what the runway under them cost. On the high ground above the town stand the memorials. An American monument on Skyline Ridge, white in the starlight, facing the sea. A Japanese memorial on the heights of Mount Austin, raised in the 1980s by the families of the men who never left. Quiet stone, facing home. Two peoples who once fought each other for this island now tend their gardens of remembrance within sight of one another, on hills that have gone back to grass and birdsong. The war ended. The memory stayed. Both somehow in peace. And below it all, in the dark water between the island and Savo, lies the Sound. More than 50 ships rest on its floor. American, Australian, Japanese, cruisers and destroyers, and great battleships lying side by side in the dark. The largest gathering of lost warships anywhere on Earth. Divers visit the shallower ones and come up quiet. The deep ones belong to the fish and the silence. Iron Bottom Sound keeps them all without taking sides, the way the sea keeps everything it is given. Let the story settle now, piece by piece, the way sand settles in still water after a wave. A plantation island under the southern stars, and a runway begun by builders with picks and shovels. Boys wading ashore through warm water into an empty morning. A night of gunfire by Savo, and an empty horizon at dawn, and 11,000 men learning to live on 2 meals a day in captured rice. One bulldozer working, the first fighters coming in over the palms, and every man on the island stopping to watch them land. A sergeant major of police who would not speak, walking out of the jungle to give his warning. A river line that held in the dark. A nameless ridge above the airfield, held for 2 long nights by tired men, and never given up. The fevers, and the rain, and the express running down the slot by night, and the great ships firing at the stars, and 3 nights in November when the whole war balanced on the water and tipped, and then the quiet. The old division sailing away to rest, the new men taking the line, the last hills, and a February morning when the patrols walked the length of the coast and found only footprints in the sand and empty boats, an island given back to itself. If you take one thing with you into sleep tonight, let it be the smallest image in the whole story. Not the battleships, not the numbers, not the names of the ridges. Just this: a young man on watch in a foxhole above the beach, long past midnight. Rain hood up, rifle across his knees. The rain has stopped. The clouds are opening. Behind him in the dark, his friends are asleep in the earth, trusting him completely. In front of him there is only the sound, black and calm, and Savo a shadow on the stars, and the surf on the reef. Breathing in, breathing out. The night passes. Nothing happens. The stars wheel slowly over the water. The tide turns without a sound, and toward morning the sky in the east goes the color of pearl, and the island, patient, green, older than any war. Begins another day. The watch changes. The tired man sleeps. The story keeps. Sleep well. The long watch will be here tomorrow night.